let me take the time to warn you about something, about all the levels of organization in a muscle. It turns out that you really have to be careful when you look at a diagram of muscles to make sure you know what you're looking at. See in the upper diagram? See, there's a whole muscle with a fascicle sticking out. Then look in the lower half of the diagram. That's a fascicle with an individual muscle fiber sticking out. Don't they look pretty similar? Yeah, I think they do. So you always have to be super careful when you look at diagrams to make sure you know what you're looking at. So once again, the top, there's a whole muscle surrounded by epimysium and a fascicle sticking out. What would that fascicle be surrounded by? Perimysium. And then in the bottom we see the fascicle surrounded by perimysium, and we see a muscle fiber sticking out. And what would that be surrounded by? Yeah, endomysium. Then look here, there's a muscle fiber. Holy smoke, doesn't that kind of look like the previous two pictures? Yeah, I think it does. So here's a muscle fiber, and it's surrounded by endomysium, and sticking out is a myofibril, which we're going to talk about coming up. And then look in the bottom, there's a myofibril, all right. Now keep watching, and holy smoke, the myofibril is made up of thick and thin filaments, so it has subparts as well. And that's what you see in this illustration here. So a muscle is kind of like, it's like, a box with the smaller box inside, and then smaller boxes inside of that, and smaller boxes inside of that. Many levels of organization. I don't think they're difficult, but you do have to kind of keep them straight. Don't get those things mixed up. Always make sure you know what you're looking at when you look at an illustration. So here, skeletal muscle tissue organization. You might wonder, why does it have all those different parts? Why do we have, muscle, and then the fascicles, and then the muscle fibers, and then the myofibrils? Well, it's kind of made up, sort of like a coaxial cable. If you ever, cut the coaxial cable at your house, that'll be great. Do it out in the front yard, and you might be able to get some neighbors involved as well. But look at the Golden Gate Bridge, right? The Golden Gate Bridge is a suspension bridge. That means that the bridge is held up by big giant cables. So you can see that in the bottom right diagram. See in the background the big tower of the Golden Gate Bridge and those cables holding it up? You might think, well, in order to hold up a big bridge, those cables probably made out of solid steel. No, actually they're not. That would be a huge mistake. Why wouldn't they do that? If they were made out of solid steel, then they would be much more likely to snap and break, okay? So in fact, if you look there in the bottom right and kind of towards the middle, see how the big giant cable, that's in Golden Gate Park, by the way, that bridge cable is like 4 feet high. It's huge. And then if you look at it close up, you can see it's made up of many, many smaller strands. And if you could look carefully at those, you would see that those smaller strands are actually made up of whole bunches of basically guitar strings. So the Golden Gate Bridge, the cables that hold it up, are actually made up of like millions and millions of guitar strings. And why? Because that confers two properties. Makes it super strong and super flexible at the same time. And that's why your muscles are made that way. Muscles need to be super strong but super flexible, okay? So that's the idea. That type of organization provides both strength and flexibility. That's why muscles are made that way. So take a look here. What are we looking at? Ooh, at the carniceria. Yeah, big chunks of meat. Look up close. See how you can see like fibers in those big chunks of steak? What are those? See those lines? What are those? They're not muscle fibers because you're looking at a whole muscle. What's the next layer down? Yeah, fascicles. Those are fascicles. You ever seen sometimes like with a cooked chicken breast, you can kind of like grab a little piece and it'll come off like string cheese? Yeah, that's a fascicle. That's what those are. So you can see those. Fascicles are actually visible. Muscle fibers would be microscopic. They're too small for the naked eye. Okay, true or false? A fascicle is a bundle of myofibrils. We're going to say that's false. A fascicle is a bundle of myofibers, or muscle fibers, and a muscle fiber is a bundle of myofibrils. All right? So it's true that there are myofibrils in a fascicle, but that's not what a fascicle is. A fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. And then each muscle fiber is made up of many, many, many myofibrils. So keep that straight, okay? Don't mix that up, all right? Make sure you keep the levels of organization straight. Now, let's zoom in on a muscle fiber. What are they actually made of? Well, originally during embryonic development, there were stem cells called myoblasts, okay? So look at all those myoblasts in the upper left. So 100 or more myoblasts fuse together to make a single muscle fiber, all right? Every muscle fiber, therefore 100 or more nuclei. Muscle fibers are multinucleated. So look again in that upper left diagram. See the muscle fiber with all those dark blobs on the outside? Those are the many, many nuclei of the original myoblasts. So they stay behind. So a muscle fiber then, made up of 100 or more individual myoblasts that all fuse together, and the nuclei stay there, and so muscle fibers are multinucleated. And then some of those myoblasts that the muscle fiber was made of stay on the outside, and those were the myosatellite cells we mentioned earlier. These are when you damage muscle, this is how the muscle repairs itself. Those myosatellite cells can reproduce to help make and repair the muscle fiber itself. The sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. So remember, every cell in your body is surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer, what we call the plasma membrane. Well, on the muscle, because a muscle cell, remember, muscle fiber, muscle cell, same thing. Muscle cells are different than most cells in your body, again, because they're multinucleated, and they're huge by comparison. So they have a big, huge membrane that covers the entire cell. That's called the sarcolemma. Remember, sarco means muscle. So the sarcolemma is nothing more than the cell membrane of a muscle cell. Keep that in mind, because we're going to be talking a lot about the sarcolemma. That's more important than you think it is right now. We're going to be talking about that when we start talking about how muscles are stimulated to contract by the nervous system. Sarcolemma is going to play a big role. The cytoplasm of a muscle is called the sarcoplasm. So remember, cytoplasm, plasm basically means goop, cytocell. So cytoplasm was the goop inside of the cell. It's all the fluid that everything's floating around in. All right? Well, again, muscle cell has its own special name. We can call it the cytoplasm of a muscle cell, but that's a lot of letters and a lot of syllables. It's easier just to say the sarcoplasm, okay? And the sarcoplasm contains two important molecules that I'm really emphasizing right now. I'm making a big deal about this, and I'm going to expect you to know it, and I'm going to ask you about it later. The sarcoplasm holds glycogen, which is composed of glucose, and myoglobin, which holds oxygen. So remember the four macromolecules of the human body. One of them was carbohydrates. Plants store glucose as starch. Animals store glucose as glycogen. So glycogen is just a big storage molecule. It's a polymer made up of individual molecules of glucose. So what happens is you actually store glucose in the form of glycogen right inside of the muscle cell. You also store myoglobin. Now muscle, globin, what word have we seen before that looks kind of like myoglobin? Yeah, hemoglobin. So hemoglobin carries oxygen in your blood. Myoglobin carries oxygen in the muscle. So think about this. Most cells don't do this. Most cells do not have glycogen in them. Most cells do not have myoglobin. Why do you suppose that a muscle cell would be special in the sense that it has a big storage molecule for glucose and a big storage molecule for oxygen? Why would that be? Because aerobic respiration, making ATP, requires oxygen and glucose. And so muscles, remember, make tons of ATP. They are the major ATP makers of your body. That's why you shiver when you get cold. Making ATP creates heat. So, and your muscles, again, move your body. Like when that chupacabra comes through the door and you have to run for your life, you suddenly need to jump up and start running. And so you don't have time to wait for the blood to bring the oxygen and glucose to your muscles. Muscles store it right inside. See how smart your body is? See how clever it is? It stores oxygen and glucose right inside the muscle cell so that you can make ATP immediately whenever you need to, okay? That's very important. Once again, I'm trying to tell you just how important I think this is. It's something that makes muscle cells very special and different from other cells. And then, of course, muscle cells have lots and lots and lots of mitochondria. Because they're making tons of ATP. So yeah, it would make sense. Muscles have massive amounts of mitochondria. Alright, so how are you doing here? Are you able to identify all these things? Huh? So what do we have there in the upper left? What structure is that? Yeah, that's the tendon. Alright. And then what layer do we see? Covering the whole outside of everything there. What layer would that be? That would be the epimysium, because it goes around the whole muscle. Then the next one over, layer it says, it's pointing down inside. What layer are we looking at there? That's endomysium, because it's going around an individual muscle fiber, okay, right? And so let's go down then next. What structure do we see there on the far right towards the bottom? What structure is that? Right, that's a muscle fiber. And once again, what layer do we have going around every muscle fiber? We have the endomysium. And then the next structure, going over to the left, what's that big thing sticking out of the muscle itself? Yeah, that's a fascicle. And what layer goes around the fascicle? The perimysium. Once again, make sure muscles, all those different layers of organization, it's easy to get them mixed up. Don't do that. Make sure you look carefully at every diagram and make sure you know what you're looking at. A picture of a muscle with fascicles looks a lot like a picture of a fascicle with muscle fibers, which looks a lot like a picture of a muscle fiber with myofibrils. Always make sure you know what you're looking at.